WSRE presents Food for Thought, in-depth presentations on political, social, and cultural topics. In January of 2010, Gary Mormino spoke on the topic, Military in the Sunshine State. His presentation took place at Northwest Florida State College in Niceville and was sponsored by the Florida Humanities Council.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Try to get a census of the audience. How many of you are native Floridians, that is, born in Florida? To put this in perspective, I gave a talk last week in Sanibel. 200 members of the Audubon Club there. Not a single member in the audience was a native of Florida. So this is pretty good. How many of you, any World War II vets in the audience? They're getting fewer. I always ask my class, I'm teaching a class on World War II this semester, and I asked my class, and a few of the older students had a father in World War II. My father was a World War II vet. Mostly now it's grandparents, but for the first time this semester, one of the students had a great-grandparent who's a World War II vet. And to put this in another way, I told the class the first day, I understand that World War II may not be naturally something you're going to be attracted to. To put this in perspective, when I was in your chair in 1965 as a freshman at Millikan University, we have several Millikan alums here, the Spanish-American War was 67 years old. And if my professor had told me, we're going to do a class around the Spanish-American War because this is really important for you to know. For the students now, World War II is 69 years old for the average student. So World War II is farther removed from students, from today's students, than the Spanish-American War was for me. So it's a long time. And I tell the students, though, that when most of you are in your 40s or 50s, you'll read in the paper that the last World War II vet has died. The youngest World War II vets now are 83. If you were 18 years old in 1945 and enlisted, you're 83 years old now. And certainly one will live to be 110. And what's extraordinary, by the way, the last, I'm not making this up, the last Civil War widow died about 4 years ago. She had married an elderly Civil War veteran in 1915, largely probably to collect the pension. And he then died the next year. And in a wonderful twist, I can't believe no one's done a book on this, she married her late husband's grandson. Wouldn't you love to have been the family reunion, the wagging tongues? But I thought it'd be interesting to look and see what this section of Florida was like on the eve of World War II. This is my favorite book. I take this book everywhere. It's called Florida, A Guide to the Southernmost State. It was done by the Federal Writers Project in 1939. So it came out in 1939. And this is what they said about Fort Walton. And now they were using the 1930 census figures, but Fort Walton, 150 population. A large summer resort on the site of a fort of the same name, is headquarters for yachts participating in the summer regattas in nearby waters. Let me find, Destin is even more interesting, by the way. They talk about Niceville was mainly known in the 1930s for blueberries. They said 12-foot high blueberry bushes. Anyone guess what the population of Destin was in 1930? Destin, 25. And old and well-known fishing village occupying a narrow strip of land between the Gulf and Bay. So this area was one of the most desolate areas in Florida in terms of population. Also in terms of economics, the timber boom was gone. Roads were often bad to non-existent. And everything changes in World War II. One of the favorite, I probably interviewed several hundred vets now, and I still think it's one of the great questions. Where were you and what were you doing December the 7th, 1941? Actually, how many of you remember December the 7th? We're old enough. See if you can beat these two stories, though. These are my two favorite stories that I've heard. Actually, three of them. I was at a group giving a talk in Homestead, Florida, and a guy came up and said he was at a root beer stand, and he thought he heard someone. Did you hear the Japs bomb? He thought he heard Whale Harbor, which is a nearby fishing village in the Keys, and he was saying, why would the Japanese want to bomb Whale Harbor in the Florida Keys? That just doesn't seem right. But anyone here from the Tampa area? There was a legendary, do you remember a TV man by the name of Salty Saul Fleischman? Salty Saul was a veteran TV man. Actually, but before he was TV man, he was a radio man. And he tells a story that on the afternoon of December the 7th, he's in the tallest building in Tampa, the Tampa Terrace Hotel, where he's broadcasting from CBS, WWII. And he's a sportscaster. He knows nothing about news. And about 2 o'clock, we now interrupt this program to bring you an urgent message. And it was the voice of John Daly, those of you who remember What's My Line later. And John Daly, you have to remember, there are no correspondents in Hawaii. And it's a very cryptic announcement. He said, planes with Japanese markings were seen strafing the island, and he pronounced it Oahu. And that's it. I mean, and Salty said, what in the world does that mean? So he goes downstairs to get a stand. Kate Smith resumes singing. And who does he meet in the lobby of the Tampa Terrace? He's just driven up, is the lieutenant commander of MacDill Airfield, Clarence Tinker. It's an amazing story. Clarence Tinker was a full-blooded Osage Indian. Looked like, square jaw. And he says, any news, Salty? And Tinker had not heard. He said, what? I just heard that the Japanese had invaded Pearl Harbor. And Tinker spits out his coffee and said, son, this means war. And kicked the Jeep driver, who awakened, and he still remembers the smell of the rubber as he pulled away. There's a sobering postscript to the story. Anyone know what happened to Clarence Tinker? He becomes the first general to die in World War II. He's sent to the Pacific, and he's killed. His plane is shot down in the Midway engagement. And his son is also killed, also in the South Pacific, in an aviation accident. So Salty Saul goes off the Coast Guard, comes back, this new family. The other is more romantic. I interviewed a couple who were married December the 7th, 1941. And he was already in uniform. In fact, if you look at a high school yearbook in 1941, half the senior class is in uniform. Great Depression, you could enlist before. And so Mr. Money is in uniform, and because it was a mixed marriage, Catholic Protestant, the marriage was held at the rectory. And they go back to his aunt's home for the reception, and in the interim is the announcement. No one in the party has heard yet about Pearl Harbor, and the groom's brother comes up and says, I just heard about Pearl Harbor, you need to get out of here now. And he tells his bride, let's go now, and she doesn't understand, she doesn't know. And it was interesting, I asked my students, what are your dreams as an 18-year-old today? Well, Elisa Money's dream in 1941 was to drive her car down Franklin Street in Tampa with tin cans behind the car with a just got married sign. And he cuts the tin cans, which kind of irks her. And remember, she doesn't know about Pearl Harbor. And they start driving on, and he's very anxious. And she turns the radio on, he turns it off. He doesn't want her to. And after they do this 3 times, she starts crying. This is not good when your bride is crying on her way honeymoon. And he tells her, and she tells me, she said, Gary, she said, my mother told me that the men are nice to you a few weeks after you get married, and then they get mean. And she said, but I thought it would last at least a week. So on the Gandhi Bridge, there's the military outfit there, and they said, "Son, you're in uniform. You've got to report for duty." And he points to the "just got married" sign, and the guy said, "Oh man," he said, "listen, take your uniform off, but don't tell anyone I told you this." And the next morning, there's an order under the beach bungalow, "report to Camp Landing." This is Camp Landing. Well, it was. Report to Camp Landing, and there's a scene worthy of a movie here. He gets out of the car in his uniform, and he's waving to her, and she said he literally blended into about 3,000 other soldiers reporting for camp. Camp Landing had gone from being a forest in Clay County to the 4th largest city in Florida. I still think this is my favorite World War II picture. It could be almost any military city. This is Stark, Florida. I don't know if you've been to Stark lately, but what's wonderful about this is in March of 1942, the New York Sun decides to send its reporters out. And they sent their great reporter, Ward Morehouse. They said, "just tell us what's happening, how the war has changed things." And of all places, he winds up in Stark. And he begins his communique, he said, "everything is gauche in Stark." Now, I'm quite sure the word gauche has not been used with Stark since then. But he's saying, he said, "my God," he said, "here's a place that was a strawberry field 5 years now, and now it's a boomtown. You can't get a room, you can't get a girl. They're begging people to work. No one, and he just said every store is open 24 hours a night." And that's Stark, Florida in 1942. And those are two, and I would do anything to find out what happened to those two young GIs. They're under by the way, look at all the bicycles. That's also telling there. But does anyone have a better Pearl Harbor story than that, by the way, than those two? How many of you remember VJ Day, August 14th, 1945? A few more. The war comes to Florida very soon. Here's an interesting question for you, and I guarantee you, when I ask this to classes now, not a hand raised. How many of you now could identify the name Colin Be Kelly? How many of you remember? Only 2 names. Wow. 3, 4. It looks like 4 names. Colin, if we were having this meeting at the end of January 1942, the war's 2 months old, I would probably, before we met, we would probably say, and we must all dedicate our lives to the memory of Colin Be Kelly, because we'll never forget him. Colin Be Kelly was the first great hero of World War II, a Floridian from Madison, Florida, born in Monticello, moved to Madison, was a West Point cadet, was in the Army Air Corps in the Philippines when the Japanese invaded in late December. Things were not going well for the United States. I mean, we're getting kicked around. And the story that first appears in the newspaper in mid-January is the one that most Americans still believe today, but it's not true. But it was a good story, that Kelly's managed to get his B-17 in the air, and Japanese shoot his plane up. He ordered his crew to bail out, which they did. He then guided his plane into a Japanese destroyer, the Haruna, destroying it. I mean, this is a great story. And he would have been awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, but MacArthur had problems with the Air and the Air Corps. But streets, Tokyo Avenue in San Francisco is renamed Colin Be Kelly. They dedicate a park in Madison. Children are named Colin Be Kelly. Franklin Roosevelt sends a telegram to Corky, his 5-year-old son, admitting him to the class of 1954 West Point. By the way, he attended West Point and graduated, but he did it on his own. He did not use the letter. Corky is now a retired Episcopalian minister. The word came out later in the war that that's not exactly what happened. First of all, the Haruna was not sunk until 1945, but he was a hero. He did order his crew out. One died. and his plane was simply shot down. It was shot down by the great Japanese ace at the war. But we needed a hero, and Colin Be Kelly was there at the right time. But we forget. I mean, that's the war came in other ways. Was anyone here living on the East Coast of Florida in 1942? What would you have seen, almost certainly, or heard? You would have heard the explosions of oil tankers and freight carriers being torpedoed by German submarines. It's probably the worst naval disaster in American history. We're totally unprepared. The Germans sank something like 30 vessels between St. Augustine Beach and Miami Beach. Mike Gannon, a historian at the University of Florida, actually interviewed one of the German U-boat commanders. And there's one story that's touching. He said that at St. Augustine Beach, they sank, or they injured an oil tanker, but were going in for the kill, and they looked on the beach, and there's thousands of people watching this. And he realized if the torpedo missed, it might go on the beach. So he actually maneuvered around between the beach and the tanker and sank the boat there. And amazingly, he managed to survive the war, which is harrowing enough. But someone who trained in Florida, who learned to fly TBM Avengers at the Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station. Anyone know the most famous graduate? Fort George Herbert Walker Bush, which is an amazing story. I mean, you think of the war today, or you think of Vietnam, and I don't think you have many senators' sons volunteering for the war. Now, technically, his father was not yet a U.S. senator. He was a powerful financier in Connecticut. But George Herbert Walker Bush was headed to Yale in the fall of 1942. And instead, he passed that up to join the Naval Air Corps, Navy Air, and learned to fly. And he became the youngest pilot shot down in World War II and rescued in the South Pacific. That's the other great coming of war to Florida. And it's really one of the great stories is from a state with a handful of military installations. By the end of the war, Florida had almost 200 military installations, ranging in size from relatively meager places like the Sopchoppy bombing range to mega bases such as Eglin, Jacksonville Naval Air Station, Pensacola Naval Air Station, MacDill Army Field, Drew Field in Tampa. Miami was almost entirely Army Air Corps. I went down there a few years ago to interview some alumni there, and that was an interesting experience. Lots of Jewish college students from New York in Army Air in Miami, and that's the other great story of World War II, the exposure of Florida to these impressionable young men. It may be the most important story of all. Now here you would argue it's the coming of MacDill. Actually, MacDill was here before the war. Here's actually a kind of a, in 1936, officers from Maxwell Field in Montgomery, Alabama, occasionally flew here. There was a golf course in Valparaiso, and they would land and they would play golf and fish. And in time, this is kind of formalized here. And what happens, it's 130 miles away. They would occasionally also play baseball teams here. And in October 1934, the Valparaiso Realty Company donated 1,500 acres of land to the U.S. War Department for a military reservation here. That's really the germ of Eglin today. The deal was accepted in 1937. The New Deal built the runways and some of the hangars early on. The first official gunnery range was in 1936, followed by bombing practice in 1938, and the first live bombs did not occur until August of 1940. Eglin is named after Lieutenant Colonel Fred Eglin, who was killed in a 1939 plane crash. That's often the way it was, not necessarily a local individual. Here's a typical headline from the Okaloosa News Journal, which will show you how lonely I am that I'm actually reading the Okaloosa News Journal. Nearly $3 million for new project at Eglin Field. That's 1944. Now, you would think, well, obviously the money was appropriated because there was a good use here. That may have been true, but in Crestview lived arguably the most powerful Florida congressman of all times, Bob Sykes. How many of you knew Bob Sykes? I won't say an ill word about Bob Sykes. He was the original Hikun, long before Lawton Childs became the Hikun. Began his life as a journalist. Was a journalism student at the University of Florida, then came here and was elected to Congress in 1940. And his first day on the job, I believe, is December the 7th. And he also announced that he had gotten Tyndall Field for Panama City. That was his first look. And by the end of the war, the joke was that if Okaloosa County had one more aviation field, the Panhandle was going to sink into the Gulf of Mexico. So successful was Bob Sykes. But this happened, he was not the only one. The U.S. Senator at the time was Claude Pepper. I think Sykes was actually older than Claude Pepper. Pepper was only 41 years old when the war began. And he was also very successful at getting the War Department to reward and create bases. Florida had natural advantages. The cheap land, 365 days a year you could fly, no mountains. But there's also some hardball politics involved, kind of like college life in Florida today. I mean, let's face it, you don't get universities and new things just for having the right stuff. The politics of this, and probably the most dashing thing that occurred here would have been in right after Pearl Harbor. They decide Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, Jimmy Doolittle, decided that he would train the men for the famous 60 seconds over Tokyo raid at Eglin Field. This was top secret. The raid is April 1942. They begin training in March of 1942. They painted white lines on the runways to indicate, well, the great challenge was how do you get, I think there were B-25s, how do you get them to fly off an aircraft carrier? You know, these were not designed for aircraft carriers, so they had to strip them down. And the big thing, obviously, you needed to be able to take off before the end of the deck. Here's from Doolittle's autobiography. I landed at Eglin Field on March the 3rd, called all the men together and told them that they would be training for an extremely dangerous mission. I cautioned them about spreading rumors and said that if anyone got particularly nosy about why we were at Eglin or what we were doing, they should give me his name and the FBI would take it from here. So this was had you been at an escaped German prisoner of war, by the way, there were German prisoners of war here, they came later, but if you had stumbled upon Eglin Field, you might have seen things that really kind of shocked you. For instance, they built in the Eglin bombing range here replicas of German villages, replicas of Japanese cities. They also did this in a lake in Polk County as well. They also trained crews here for skip bombing. And they also, German V-1 rocket launching sites were improvised here so pilots would know what they look like. So this was a really interesting chapter in the war, but there were literally hundreds of other examples in Florida. The relationship between the town and gown is an interesting one, in the town and the military base. One of the great challenges was, of course, race relations. Florida was a southern state in 1941. If I were to ask you today, it's without qualifying what southern means, how many of you would say, yes, Florida is a southern state today? Not saying Okaloosa County, but the state of Florida. Most people don't think Florida is a southern state today. There was no question in 1941. I mean, Florida was part of it was the southernmost state. And lots of problems developed between, particularly African Americans who were raised in the North. And you could understand this. If you're ready to die for your country, you would think you'd be able to buy a beer at a place. And in Tampa, there's a very well-known story. The sheriff would meet each bus of incoming black military people and informing them what is acceptable and unacceptable in the South. And you have some nasty engagements between civilians and troops across Florida. One of the most interesting places was Camp Gordon Johnson, not that far from here, in Carabel. Camp Gordon Johnson was often called the military Alcatraz because of training conditions there. They were training for amphibious landings. And probably more soldiers died at Camp Gordon Johnson of drowning. By the way, one soldier died at Eglin. He jumped into a foxhole filled with rattlesnakes. That was a bad way, but this is rattlesnake heaven and haven. But there wasn't much, let's face it, in Carabel in 1942-43. So the soldiers understood that there was an all-women's college in Tallahassee. In those days, it was Florida State College for women. Today's Florida State University. And other soldiers also knew that. So if you read the Tallahassee newspapers, people are sleeping in parks, in post offices. There's literally not a bed to be had. We're talking about hundreds, thousands of people at this time. Gainesville is interesting. Gainesville is all male. The undergraduate experience there is all male, and the war will change that. Gainesville is so stressed by the war that by 1942, only 700 students are enrolled in Gainesville. You have accounting classes of 700 today at Gainesville. 700 students. How bad did it get? The University of Florida gave up football for 2 years during the war. Now, we're talking sacrifice. But that number is a little short-sighted because there were soldiers studying at the University of Florida. When the war begins, there's so many people volunteering. Initially, they said, particularly students who were freshmen, they said, listen, why don't we do this? Rather than volunteer now, you can enlist now, but we'll put you through a speedy college experience. You can take 3 years and a year and a half, but you'll be in uniform, you'll do drills. This was called, in some places, the V-12 program. And probably half the schools in Florida had parallel colleges, but for the military at that time. University of Miami. Many of these schools, by the way, were stripped of males. Private schools. The University of Tampa in 1944 had one male graduate in the class of 44. Florida Southern, almost no males at this time. This is a real crisis in higher education. But it's also a time of great opportunity. Dwight Eisenhower later he created this term called the military-industrial complex. Well, in World War II, people have called it the military educational complex because in some ways the federal government is pouring unheard of money in higher education that it had never done before. It had always been, especially for private schools, there would be no federal money. Now for the first time in American history, in fact, when the GI Bill comes out now, the GI Bill did not discriminate. You could use your GI Bill at Notre Dame, Bob Jones University, or public schools. That's a real trend. For higher education in America, a lot of people would have been shocked at how we accommodated that after the war. Let me talk about the home front. I'm working on a book on Florida in World War II now, and I think it's the home front that's in many ways more exciting for me than the battlefront. The home front changes. In fact, it's one of the great themes in American literature. Well, what's the first story about the soldier coming home? He's worried. Has his wife been faithful? Will I recognize my village? That's the Odyssey. Odysseus returning after this long voyage and military campaign. And yes, Penelope was faithful. In fact, he kills all of her suitors just to be sure. But the home front, never before or since has America been so united as those years. In fact, since then, every president has tried. How can I get Americans to sacrifice and to care about one another like it was in World War II? What's the moral equivalent of war? No one has been able to figure it out. In fact, looking back at it, we probably weren't asked to sacrifice as much as we should have been in other wars. But during World War II, on the home front, women, first of all, women went to work. Let me give you a multiple choice exam, or actually a true-false exam first. For the first time in American history, large numbers of women worked for wages during World War II. True? How many would say true? It's actually false. Large numbers of women had always worked for wages, but who were they? They were poor women, they were immigrant women, they were black women. The big difference in World War II, middle-class, white, married women go to work for wages. That group had not. In fact, a lot of school systems prior to World War II, if you were female and married, they made you quit because it looked bad, for the husband, if your wife was working when he was married. Many schools had contracts that when you got married, you quit your job. But in World War II, there's such a vacuum of jobs. For instance, in Tampa, I should have had a video camera, but about 15 years ago, a friend of mine wrote a story on women who worked in the shipping industry, shipbuilding industry in Tampa, that if they have stories to share or artifacts to share, would you come to the university library on Saturday morning? And I go in the room, there's like 50 women there. And one of them told me she was raised on a farm in Florida, had never worn blue jeans prior to that time. Even ladies on a farm didn't wear blue jeans. She gets a job, a union job as a welder in the shipyard, making more money than her husband. And of course, you had to wear blue jeans to work. She had a picture of about 12 of her compatriots, all women, with the big helmets, the welding helmets on. And I'm thinking, wow, to find out what happened to those ladies, that would be a great story. One of the ladies at the Tampa shipyards was what's the word I'm looking for? Trapeze artist. And she worked at the tallest spot in the ship because men didn't like it because of the height, and she had no problem with height. And so she welded like from a trapeze device on the top of the ship. It's interesting. Students have interviewed African American women who also worked. And it's very interesting. Most black women told her, the war really didn't change our lives that much at all. Whereas white women, the war is the great watershed. We were poor before the war. We had bad jobs. We had bad jobs during the war. Nothing that much changed after the war. So much of it is perspective. Now, a lot of African Americans moved north during the war. I mean, if you were picking oranges in South Florida, why would you stay and pick oranges during the war? If you could go to Detroit or Seattle or Pittsburgh, you could make more in a day than you could make in a month back home. You wouldn't have to ride in the back of the bus, better schools for your kids. So there's a real exodus of jobs out. How many of you were children during World War II? I'm guessing many of you. I'm trying to get students to do research papers on this. I think this is a great idea for a book for someone, would be the children's lives during the war. I hope to hear some of these when we have a chance today. Children volunteered. They also purchased war bond stamps, aluminum drives, scrap drives. What would you use grease for, by the way? Why would you collect grease? What's grease used for? Yes, if explosives, exactly. The glycerin, I think, in the grease is used. Metal. I mean, they were melting down Civil War cannons. I mean, everyone at this time. It's really an extraordinary home front. Also, in terms of women, would be attitudes towards sexuality. Can you be feminine and a welder at the same time? And there's a tremendous dialogue going on in the newspapers about new hairstyles, etc. The women in the service paid a tremendous amount of attention to the detail of the uniforms. Did any of your mothers join the war, the WWII or WWII? What outfit?
My mother was a Navy nurse. She was a medical surgical nurse.
Interesting. Where did she go to basic? Do you remember?
Well, Virginia, and then she wound up in Farragut, Idaho, where there was a big Navy hospital, and then she was based in Honolulu.
Interesting.
After the war.
Yeah.
And she saw a lot of Pacific area
Mhm.
casualties, the ones who survived.
Yeah.
To Honolulu, to the big hospital there.
I went to Daytona Beach had a WWII base there, and I went to a WWII reunion about 10 years ago, and that was really interesting. First of all, most of the WWIIs and WWIIs had college of some kind. These are not the poorest women in America, and it was very selective to get in these. But it's fascinating to talk to them about who they dated in Daytona and what they thought of the South, et cetera. But terrific stories. They would, the Tampa Tribune every day would have this little column. It was called kind of Man on the Street or something like this. But they would have a question of the day, and they would ask pedestrians. And one of the questions of the day, can you imagine asking this now? Would you mind if your boyfriend dated while overseas? And most of the women did mind, by the way. But it was also interesting, a question I think would be, at least outside Eglin, unimaginable for most Floridians. What's your favorite aircraft? And this is a great story of World War II as well. Americans fell in love with flight. You got to realize, most people had never flown before. You had to be wealthy to fly on Pan Am. But World War II literally, from a few thousand trained pilots on the eve of World War II, I think there were 100,000 pilots by the end of the war. And it ushers in a kind of a time of, let's face it, you have to have faith to get inside an airplane. That's not the most natural act to do. But newspapers, the Okaloosa paper would have this, the profile of a Messerschmitt and a Zero, just in case the Japanese decide to invade Fort Walton Beach or something like this. But Americans, they would ask them, and it was interesting, the P-38 Lightning was something. By the way, the Florida Humanities Council did a World War II issue about 10 years ago, and I was the editor of it. And it wasn't my mistake, but as the editor you get blamed. But someone misidentified a P-38 Lightning for a P-39 training plane. And literally, 5 o'clock, in the morning, I started getting calls from people saying, what an idiot, who could not? And my father even saw P-38s in the South Pacific. But oh my God, people do remember those distinctive, P-51 Mustangs and all this. It was a rather romantic age of flight in this sense. Love and war. How many of your parents were married during or right after World War II? Mine too. In fact, it's interesting. My father was a Seabee in the South Pacific and died last spring. My other mother had died earlier. And we found, much to my shock, my father's love letters. My father was not a romantic person. I never saw my parents hug or kiss. He was very old world Italian, no nonsense. But these World War II love letters were touching, I must admit. Even though he was misspelling her name. Seriously, she was Mabel, M-A-B-L-E, and throughout this, he was writing M-A-B-E-L. And we also discovered my mother had several other boyfriends that we didn't know about at this time. So, I have probably a couple dozen love letters that veterans had given me. It's a question you don't ask your first interview, but as you develop relationship. But think of a place like Eglin. If you were a local girl, my God, the variety. You soon learn to identify the meaning of stripes and insignia and things like this. But I bet there must have been hundreds of local girls get married during the war and certainly thereafter. At the same time, there's an obsession in the papers over social diseases at this time. I mean, let's face it, you don't need a sociologist to tell you if you take an 18-year-old guy, put him in basic training and you let him go, they're probably not going to seek out libraries and museums. and there's another great book. I'm not being facetious now. I think it would be fascinating to interview ex-prostitutes. I really would love to know, did things work out? I mean, or was it like From Here to Eternity, on the way back to San Francisco? But I suspect not, but it would be an I'm not sure how one goes about doing this. If you have thoughts on this, let me know. August 14th, 1945, happiest day collectively, spontaneously in American history, VJ Day. VE Day was rather subdued in most communities. Very, very few wild celebrations. There's this grim resolve. We've got another war to win. And frankly, in the spring and summer of 1945, no one was expecting a quick victory. Iwo Jima and Okinawa had gone terribly. My father was at Okinawa. Just these were ghastly. Has anyone here read Flags of Our Fathers? Well, it's a brutal book. I mean, and if Iwo Jima was going to be bad, what would an invasion of the Japanese islands be? I probably wouldn't be here. But the war ended quickly because of the atomic bombs. Probably no reason to debate this. I'm actually one of the few historians among my colleagues. I accept the decision. I think it saved lives on both sides. I understand the moral arguments, but in my mind, I mean, the Japanese had been defeated. The burden should be on the Japanese, not the American commanders for this. The decision to drop the second bomb I have more problems with, but regardless, the war is over August 14th, 1945, at a time much earlier than everyone knew. And it's a fascinating story to go to the Florida newspapers. It is pure delirium. Small towns, big towns. In Tampa, the reporter said, some girls kissed only Marines, some Marines kissed only blondes. I asked my students, can you imagine a time when you were kissing complete strangers? But they have no problems with this. But I think it tells you more about me than young people there. But in some places, factory whistles went off. When's the last time you heard a factory whistle in Florida? But it's pure delirium. Interestingly, by the way, there's a fascinating Florida footnote. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tibbets was a Miami native. He lived in Miami, and on the morning of August 5th, 1945, in Tinian Island, someone said, you haven't named your plane, his B-27, or B-29 rather, Super Fortress. And most would have put, the Betsy Lou or something like this, and of course he put his mother's name on the plane, the Enola Gay. His mother was an Iowa girl who was living in Florida, and she becomes the most famous person in America at this time. Tibbets was a University of Florida student. He dropped out and had a terrific argument with his father. His father was a World War I vet who wanted his son to be a physician. And his mother took his son's sides and said, things will be all right. And so he always was partial to his mother. And so Paul Tibbets from Miami kind of ends the war. But the great story in my mind is the consequences of war. What are the consequences of World War II, particularly for Florida? But put this in perspective. On the eve of Pearl Harbor, we were the smallest state in the American South. imagine, in 1940, Arkansas and South Carolina had more inhabitants than Florida. We were just shy of 2 million. For most Americans, Florida was inaccessible, it was remote, it was too hot, too wet. And now, 2 million veterans have trained here. They all have kind of rose-colored memories of Florida. Imagine if you were in Miami Beach. I hadn't developed this yet, but there's such an urgency to train soldiers. Someone has an idea, rather than build new barracks, why not use the existing hotels in Miami and Miami Beach, Palm Beach? And that's what they did. So imagine you're writing your girlfriend or your mother that your barrack is the Blackstone Hotel in the Art Deco district of Miami Beach, and it's February and there are palm trees and girls in bathing suits. My God, your memory coming back. But also memories of Eglin. Of this pristine bay, the environment, cheap land. Every veteran pledged to return to Florida one day, and they would as retirees, as transplants, as tourists. I think you could make an argument that probably everyone came back. But the war also revolutionized Florida. It's the prosperity generated by the war. We were a depression nation going into the war. Now, during the war, it's the most prosperous period. In fact, it's almost unseemly that a nation fighting a two-front war should be getting richer in the process. In fact, Americans, there are columns in the newspapers about weight gains by the end of the war, in spite of the rationing. But most Americans have money in their pocket. You've worked double shifts. You can't buy a new car. You can't even buy tires. And so Americans have money in their pocket. And now, unlike World War I, in fact, it's very interesting. In 1944, congressmen get together, and frankly, they're worried. They said, what's going to happen when the war ends if 12 million servicemen return at once and flood the job market? And everyone there remembered what happened at the end of World War I, which led to arguably the wackiest year in American history, 1918, 1919, the Red Scare, influenza, labor riots, race riots, a Black Sox scandal. It's a disaster. So Congress passed what they called the Veterans Readjustment Act. We called the GI Bill, which was brilliant. First of all, it revolutionized higher education. In Florida, you created a junior college system after the war, a complete junior in the 50s. But University of Florida has so many students, Florida State College for Women had to go co-ed and admit male students at this time. Private colleges are overwhelmed. The GI Bill would pay your tuition anywhere, Harvard or St. Petersburg Junior College or even a barber school. Arguably the greatest political piece of legislation ever passed in its popularity and its impact. Think of, you had a truck driver who now became a physician. I was telling friends last night, a friend of mine who had just died, John E. Oreo was his name, an Italian immigrant, but he had come to America and was 1 month old. And he wants to join the 101st Airborne. He's living in New Jersey, and the FBI tells him, son, you're technically an enemy alien, but given the circumstances, let's talk to your priest, your teachers. In fact, they all agreed he's patriotic, and they had a ceremony at his dining room table. And they looked at him and said, John Iorio, we have one question for you before you sign these papers. Would you be willing to bomb your hometown? And he replied, why would I want to bomb Trenton, New Jersey? Johnny Oreo winds up at Columbia. He said he was going to be a truck driver. And interestingly, he gets an announcement. He's to appear at a Saturday venue. And he's there, and hundreds of guys there. It's a class in enunciation. Columbia, for the first time, was admitting non-15th generation Americans off the Mayflower. And they were admitting guys from Jersey, with Jersey accents, 33rd Street, and they said, you should talk like a Columbia man. And I mean, isn't that amazing? Can you imagine a college president trying to do that today? Getting students to talk like Columbia men. But it's a great success. His daughter, by the way, is mayor of Tampa, Pam Iorio, mayor of Tampa, who wants to be a college president, by the way. But the GI Bill and the impact of the war is extraordinary. It also ushered in a revolution in race relations in Florida. You can make an argument the civil rights movement begins in Miami at the end of World War II. A group of black ministers decide, let's see what happens when we go swimming on the White Beach, Haulover Beach. And they go there and they stick their feet in the water, and the policemen are there and they're saying, you know, they're really not doing anything to be arrested for, and they let them do it. And emboldened, they eventually get their own black beach. But people coming back from the war, many of the veterans are saying, you know, we're not going to take this anymore. We fought and died for our country. We think this should be a better America. A more complicated argument is, what did the war mean for American women? And there are really two groups arguing this, so there's no answer. The generation kind of my age, the first generation of female historians in the late 60s and 70s, they all argued nothing revolutionized women's rights more than World War II. Women saw that they could work, they could balance a checkbook, they made the same wages, and then what happened when the GIs came back, they just took the jobs away. And it was up to their daughters to dance their undanced dreams. Young historians, the next generation said, you know, you got it all wrong. That may please your values to think that way, but in fact, they said most of the women in World War II, they wanted to get rid of, who wants to work at a shipyards? They wanted to get married, they wanted to have kids, they wanted to move to suburbia, and it's their children. So the answer is probably somewhere in between, but the war certainly was a revolution. It also changed white ethnic groups, Jews, Italians, groups like that, who were, any Italian Americans here today? Not many Italians in Okaloosa. But groups who were kind of on the margins. Being Italian in 1940 wasn't exactly fashionable. But huge numbers of Italians joined the service. I mean, think of the challenge of World War II, of bringing in all these people from different regions, different races, different religions, feeding them all a regimented diet. It did have an impact that if you were Italian or Jewish, somehow that didn't seem as big a deal after the war when you were fighting Hitler, who was killing Jews at this time. So the war has a positive impact, I think, on ethnic relations in America. You had so few Asians in Florida. There was a small Japanese colony called Yamato near Boca Raton that was breaking up. It was an agricultural colony. And I think they put about 4 or 5 Japanese, they incarcerated them. Yes, now there was a farm, and there's a formal gardens there now. But you just didn't have much of a, you did have a lot of Italian immigrants. And that's an interesting story. I mean, if you think about it, we were also fighting Italy. Many Italian immigrants were quite fond of Mussolini. And relatively few Italian immigrants were incarcerated, largely because, if you think about it, who's the greatest baseball player in America in 1941? Joe DiMaggio. The mayor of New York City is an Italian immigrant, Fiorello LaGuardia. The mayor of San Francisco, Rossi, is an Italian immigrant. You're going to put Joe DiMaggio's father is an illegal or a enemy alien. You're going to put him in jail, Joe DiMaggio's father? So Italians had positive role models and political connections. Most Italians were Democrats. So Italians really never paid the price the Japanese did.
But German Americans.
You had very few German Americans here. You did have about 9,000 German prisoners of war here. A colleague of mine has written a book called Hitler's Soldiers in the Sunshine State, and that's an interesting book. They picked oranges in South Florida. They swept Miami Beach streets. They were mainly brought in for labor. There's a real problem in Florida during the war of who's going to pick the oranges. So many African Americans left. We actually brought in Caribbean laborers there. So you had, and he was saying there was a lot of violence within the German POW community, that the first Germans who were brought in were quite passionate Nazis. They really believed in the cause. By the end of the war, these 18-year-old kids, they might not even have been Germans. They might have been Ukrainians or Poles. They could have cared less. They were delighted to be in Florida. And the old-timers did not like these young POWs with their blasé attitudes. Well, a story I didn't mention, there was good reason to be looking at that time. In June of 1942, 4 German saboteurs landed just below Jacksonville Beach, Ponte Vedra, and the 4 others landed at Long Island the same time, and someone always knows this they got off a submarine, and they had swimming suits on, and they had bags of detonators and cash and clothes, but all of them wore their German Marine hats with the double eagle and Nazi insignia. Why, if you were an invader, would you wear someone always knows this, by the way. Because
you weren't, if you were in civilian clothes, you get shot. They got shot anyway.
Yeah, they wanted to be, if captured, to be tried as POWs. One of them gave the others up. They were captured, tried, and executed in about 4 weeks. 6 of the 8, two of the 8 were sent back. I think they were hanged, by the way. I don't think they were, well, I'm not sure if they were hanged or shot. But there's a famous Tampa Tribune reporter named Tom McEwen who was in charge. He was just a young guy in charge of a Japanese prisoner camp in the Philippines. And he told me, honestly, he did not hear the term Geneva Convention until he saw the movie Stalag 17. There was a Geneva Convention. It met in the 30s, and that spelled out exactly how you're to treat prisoners of war. And what's interesting, if you were an American in a German prisoner of war camp, you were treated relatively well. Most of them, about 9 in 10, came back. I swear this is true. I interviewed a guy in Sarasota who said that while in a German prisoner of war camp, he took a class from the London School of Economics. The books arrived and everything. If you were in a Japanese prisoner camp, it was much different. Now, the reality was life was also much different for Japanese. So, but about half of them came back, I think, alive. If you look at the war in Europe and the war in the Pacific, you have incidents of simply shooting prisoners, but that's unusual. Generally, I think the attitude was the Germans aren't that much different from us. They have a loony leader, and there was relative respect. That was not true with Japan, with the war there. In fact, in Gadsden County, businessmen put up a fund of $50 to give the first Gadsden County soldier to kill a Japanese soldier. I mean, can you imagine a group doing that today? The outcry at that? But I mean, it was a different war in the Pacific.